everybody, and welcome back to our channel. We are Brigade of Beans, a diagnosed dissociative identity disorder system. My name is Griffin, and today I'm going to be discussing whether or not the films Split and Glass are good representations of dissociative identity disorder. So before we get into any spoilers or anything like that, I need to do a couple of disclaimers and some trigger warnings. The disclaimer is this is just our opinions. Different people will have different opinions on these two films, and that is okay. Secondly, trigger warnings. If you haven't seen Split and Glass, there are substantial trigger warnings for these films, and by proxy of us discussing them, trigger warnings about this video as well. Because of how ingrained these triggering topics are within the two films, I can't really give you timestamps to skip to, so please just assume that these content warnings apply to the whole video, although they will be more intense in some specific spots. The main trigger warnings that you need to be aware of are kidnapping, sexual assault, childhood abuse, physical abuse, unethical medical practices, physical violence, cannibalism, fucked up psychiatric hospitals, or hospitals singular. There's probably other things as well, but stuff should fall under those broad categories. They're not nice, fun, wholesome films. Let's just put it that way. The final point of logisticals is the structure of this video. We have three main questions that we're looking to answer, and those are: does the system actually fit the DID criteria? Do the films use the evil alter trope? And did we enjoy the films? And then we will go through 5 points that we liked about the films, and then 5 points that we disliked, and then at the end we'll come back around and we will answer those three questions. So without further ado, let's get this started with something that we liked about the films. The first thing that we liked is the accuracy in which some of the experiences that come along with DID are portrayed. There are a lot of moments, in especially Split, less so in Glass, but still a couple, where as a system we heavily relate to what the system goes through, and we can see our experiences in them. And it's often also experiences that aren't really included in DID media. One example of this is that before the actual events of Split take place, there is a triggering event when the system is at work. There are some, I believe it was high school age girls, came up and exposed themselves to the system. And this triggered stuff internally for the system, and is what actually results in the Horde, which is the name that the system gives the alters who are aligned with the beast, start to have more control over the system. And it pushes Dennis and Patricia into the more front space. They call it the light within the film. I'm going to say front because that is the language that comes naturally to us, but it's the same thing. It's just different words for being in control of the body. And it's very realistic to have an event that is deeply triggering to the system cause a complete shift in the alters who are fronting and who are present in day-to-day life and who are acting with authority. Another system experience that we see within the film that we don't really see talked about is child parts having large amounts of control and influence within the system. This isn't going to be in every single case, but there are instances within systems where child alters are their gatekeepers, or can control who fronts, or control where memories lie. And a lot of times when there is media about DID, the kids are innocent and sweet or heavily traumatized, and are these small things that need to be protected, instead of sometimes the reality being that you have someone who is quite young, in the film it's Hedwig, who is 9, having a lot of control over the system. And there are still elements that are about them that are quite young, but they also have immense control and immense ability within the system. Within Split and Glass, Hedwig is able to control who has the light, who is fronting. And this, they're then running off this 9-year-old's choice of who is in control of the body and the life. And it's easy to manipulate a child sometimes, not always, but it can be. And I feel like it can... It's Caroline. We're probably going to switch a lot in this video. 1, because we have a lot of thoughts, and 2, because even though the films themselves, at least Split, isn't too triggering for us, the whole conversation around Split is, and so we're going to switch more. But it is a piece of media that we do want to talk about because it has had such an impact on how people view DID in such a negative way. Another example of a system experience that we really, really liked how it was portrayed was Dennis masking as Barry. And this to us was the most authentic and realistic way that the differences in alters was presented within the film. And it's really common for alters within systems, that is, to mask as the host or whoever is fronting a lot, and to mask as somebody else when they don't want to be recognized or they're not comfortable being recognized. And I feel like that was portrayed really well within the film. Dennis was acting fairly similar to Barry, but there were small tells that their therapist, Dr. Fletcher, could pick up on. These tells included how Dennis's OCD presented, which is a whole other conversation. We don't have it within this video because there were a lot of things that we dislike about it. But I will just say here and now, I do not like how OCD was presented within this film. However, as someone without OCD, that's not our area of expertise, so I'm not going to comment much more on it, but it was not our favorite thing in the world. Our opinions on OCD representation in Split aside, the ways in which Dr. Fletcher was able to pick up that she was speaking to someone else and she tried to examine that was relatively realistic. I don't necessarily agree with all of Dr. Fletcher's choices that she made. We'll get into that as well, but that interaction was far more realistic to us than any other depictions of alters switching in anywhere else in the film. And then the final system experience that we felt was very realistic to things we've experienced happened in Glass. And there are a lot of caveats around this because in reality, the experience that Patricia was having wasn't actually real because she was being gaslit and lied to by the psychiatrist. Something else we'll get into. So Patricia is in group and the psychiatrist, whose name I can't remember, we're just going to call her psychiatrist asshole, was explaining to Patricia that the Beast is no more skilled than a regular human, that the feats that he did in Split were explainable, were possible with a normal, strong human body, and was explaining that it was a belief that was held within the system that they had a strong, supernaturally powered alter, and that belief was there, but it wasn't real. And Patricia starting to doubt if the Beast really was supernaturally strong and supernaturally fast, or if it was explainable. And the grief and despair and emotional pain that she went through in those moments was very relatable as a system who's had really strongly held beliefs about specific things happening or occurring that turned out to not be true. And her pain and how that was portrayed spoke really, really deeply to us as a system. I can't just leave it there because all of that was a lie, and the Beast does have superpowers, and that's something that we will get into because, oh my God, was Glass bad? But there were moments within Split and within Glass that really, really spoke to us. But they were so small in comparison to just how much we found wrong with this film. But there were small moments where we went, yes, that's what this is like. This is what it is like to live with DID. And there were those small moments, and that was very cool to get to see. Okay, flipping over to the negatives, the first thing that we dislike about Split and Glass is just how overt the system is. I'm very careful with how I phrase this because I don't want to say no systems are like this, because that's not true. Systems can be very overt. It is the minority of system presentation, but it is still a thing that occurs. We have met systems who present very overtly, and there is nothing that devalues their experiences or delegitimates their experience by me saying that it is the minority of examples. However, within media, I cannot think of a single piece of DID media where the system is truly covert. They are all overt. And so I will consistently criticize how overt systems are in media because there is an unfair balance in representation. And Split is a glaring example of that. The system is so overt. Every single alter has a very differentiated accent. Every single alter has different fashion senses. Every single alter is very, very differentiated in personality and identity. And it is very, very extreme. And my main critique here is systems who are very overt, that's often part of the safety mechanism. They needed to be overt for their safety. For whatever that specifically means for them, being overt was the safest for their system. But from the glimpses that we get about this system's childhood, they were punished consistently for being too loud or being too messy or being too much. And so it doesn't make sense to us Admittedly, we don't have a lot of their traumatic backstory, but it doesn't make sense to us why a system would form so overtly when they were consistently punished for being seen. And I could argue why that would happen, but realistically, it probably wouldn't form that way. And it felt to us, watching the film, that the overtness of the system was not in place because it reflected the system's childhood, but because it would be attention grabbing for the audience. It felt like the system was overt in the way that it was because it would be something that would make people go, oh my God, that's weird. How does that work? I want to watch this because I don't understand. And so they either want to learn from the film, which one, don't learn from thriller films about psychiatric disorders and mental health conditions and people's lived experiences as dissociative systems. And two, it's not a good representation of DID, mostly because there are some really, really solid and true facts in there, littered with some absolutely abhorrent lies. Maybe lies isn't true, but mistruth at the very least. Some examples of this is just how quickly the system changes clothes when an alter switches in. We know systems who do or have changed clothes when they switch because it makes whoever is fronting feel more comfortable. But the speed in which these clothes changes happen, and in situations where it wouldn't be realistic for that to occur, just makes it a thing that's meant to draw the audience in and isn't then realistic and authentic to the actual system themselves. And that is a huge problem because it then exacerbates this idea that systemhood is always this big obvious thing that you always see when it isn't. Like, we've switched in this video, we didn't go and change our clothes because why would we? We're sitting down and filming a video. Meanwhile, if I was to be planning to go out, I might change my clothes. But there's no need for me to do that when I'm continuing a task. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. There's also very little dissociation evident within the film from the system themselves. There is dissociation from other characters, that's another point we'll get into, but for the system, the only dissociation we really see is the altered identities and some amnesia. But there's no derealization, there's no depersonalization, there's no just general dissociation depicted from the system. There should be, especially in Glass, a lot more dissociation because the system is triggered over and over and over again to switch using visual cues. And when you are forced into rapid switching, I do not know a single system when forced into that environment that is having solid, grounded switches between each part like this, which is how the film portrayed it. It is much, much, much more likely from our experience and from talking to other systems that you will be switching, but you will not have a solid sense of identity. You'll be very dissociated, you'll be very dysregulated, you will not be grounded. And whilst you might be going like this, you would not be going, this is me, this is me, this is me. It's far, far more complex and confusing and dysregulating. And it was portrayed as just people were there and there and there and grounded and themselves, and that is not, I shouldn't say it's not how it ever works because there's possibly a system who would react that way, but it's very, very unlikely. And there's all of these very, very niche and minority experiences lumped into one system who is displayed as having very, very little dissociation, which is ironic considering dissociative identity disorder is a dissociative disorder. And so it's frustrating just how overt the system is to have an almost complete lack of other symptoms present and discussed and experienced by the system. Flipping back to things that we enjoyed about the films, this is more specifically for Split and less so for Glass, but we like that there seems to be a lack of push towards final fusion. It seems to be, and whilst healing goals aren't explicitly stated, that the system is happy with functional multiplicity. They've been working a consistent job. They are video journaling to each other. They have an awareness of each other. They're doing regular therapy. And it seems to be that their goal is to exist harmoniously together. And that is nice to be able to see in media that there is this representation for you can live successful lives while still being apart. Successful lives, maybe not, considering that they then go on to commit horrific crimes and die at the end of Glass. Spoilers. But they were at least being set up for that if they weren't then used as a pawn in a thriller film for further stigmatization of an already stigmatized disorder. But within that functional multiplicity seeming to be a thing that they're pursuing, they do video journals to each other. And that's something that we've personally found really, really helpful. We've found it more helpful than traditional handwritten journaling or drawing to each other. And so it's nice to see a representation of that. And yeah, that's the next thing we like. As you can see, we're getting into less and less detail for things that we like, and it's only point 2. Second thing that we dislike, this is our major gripe with the films. DID does not grant someone supernatural abilities. End of story. When this point is brought up, some people will point out the fact like, hey, but there are other characters who have supernatural abilities, especially in Glass. And I see that, I understand where they're coming from, but they're glossing over the whole subplot of Split where Dr. Fletcher is trying to legitimize DID, even though it's already a legitimate disorder, and is talking about these things that are happening to her clients that are fantastical and supernatural. The big example of this is Dr. Fletcher saying that she had a DID client who had 3 alters start to front and it repaired their optic nerves. I think that's what it was. That cannot happen. You can have alters who have different vision, including no vision within a system. But this isn't to do with a physical repair. It happens when a system is forming these alters and going through trauma, and their brain is dissociating and pulling away from the traumatic event, and that can include shutting down parts of your sensory experiences. This is part of what a FOP response is. I'm pretty sure it's FOP. It might be freeze. It's one of them, all right? Not a scientist, not a psychologist, just the person living with this shit. But your brain can disconnect from your senses. It's why when people are going through traumatic experiences, they might not be able to remember anything or remember the visuals or remember the sound. And so for systems, this dissociation from your senses can become inherently linked to specific alters. It's why different alters and systems can have different pain tolerances or might have different taste buds, and some have different vision and some have different hearing. However, that's not to do with physical magical healing that occurs. And it also isn't that common. It's again talking about all these niche experiences that aren't actually super common in how DID really presents in a day-to-day life. Like on a day-to-day basis, most people can't tell when they're interacting with a system, even a system who's very overt, because they just don't see it. And then, of course, there's the fact that the beast is super strong and has thick skin and can crawl on walls and all of this shit that isn't how DID works. You can't just have one alter who is way more capable than the physical body is. Everyone is only as capable as the physical body is. And so that means if you're blind, you're not just going to have alters who can see. And if you are a weightlifter, then maybe you'll have alters who can lift heavy weights, but they're not supernaturally strong. This point really frustrates me because it's pushed as well by Dr. Fletcher that DID might be the next step in human evolution. They might have realized parts of their brain that other people haven't. And I think that's such a fundamentally fucked up idea to try and push, because DID stems from prolonged, inescapable childhood trauma. And so trying to imply that that is what gets you to the next step in human evolution is fucked up, because that's implying that we should be going around traumatizing children so that we can evolve better. And I hope that you can see why that would be a big fucking problem. Okay, I took a break. I went and put laundry on. I'm back for the third thing that we liked about Split and Glass, and that is the fact that it is reinforced over and over again that dissociative identity disorder stems from childhood trauma. That is literally the bare minimum of what we want out of DID representation, and it isn't always there. So it was nice to actually see. We see the trauma that, or some of the trauma that causes the system to form. Did not think that it was accurate in the way that the system presents as to the trauma that they endured, but we've already covered that. And the other thing that I liked about it is that it was not pushed that DID was a delusion, that the alters in the system were a delusion. In Glass, one of the plot points is that the psychiatrist who is meant to be treating them before they go to court is trying to treat them for a delusion disorder. That disorder is not specifically specified. I have a lot of issues with how that was presented. They're like, you have delusions, this disorder, and didn't actually specify what disorder was causing the delusions, because delusions are caused by a lot of different disorders, and sometimes it's not even a disorder in play that's causing a delusion. Those points aside, even with all of that, even with this psychiatrist trying to say that the beast was a delusion, that the supernatural abilities were delusions, it was not at any point in time presented that the alters and the systems were delusions, which I feel like would have been a very easy thing for the films to do, and it was nice that they didn't do that, because alters are not delusions. DID has nothing to do with psychosis, and while someone can have both psychosis and DID, and delusions and DID, delusions are not inherently related to DID, and especially alters are not delusions. That is very, very important, and it was nice that the film didn't go there, even though it had the option to. However, this brings us to the third thing that we dislike, and it is the idea that there is a real one, that there is a real alter. They do not say core within the films, but it's very much representative of how core theory is understood and presented to people. And that is not true. There is not a real one when it comes to dissociative identity disorder. Every single alter in a system is as real as the next one. There might be alters with more external influence or internal evidence. There might be alters who are more complex and well-rounded and alters who are more fragmented, but that doesn't make any of them less real than the others, and it doesn't mean that any of them automatically have more ownership of the body and the life than anybody else in the system. But in Glass, there is this constant push that it is Kevin's body, that it is Kevin's system, Kevin this, Kevin that. In the accreditations, when you Google Split and look at the actors who acted in Split, James McAvoy is accredited as playing Kevin, which to us is ludicrous because Kevin as an alter is on screen for maybe a minute, I didn't time it, not a long time. A very, very small amount of time in comparison to Dennis and Patricia and Hedwig and the Beast. And so it does not make sense to us for him to be accredited as Kevin, because Kevin at this point in time in the system's life isn't even the system's host. Barry is. Barry is who's been doing all of their daily life things. Kevin hasn't fronted since 2015. And it's really common for the alters who relate to the body to not front. Sometimes they also do front a lot. It depends system to system. But just because an alter has the body's name doesn't make them the real one and doesn't mean that they have authority over what goes on in that system's life. It can do. Some systems do function like that, but that's not how it works by proxy. And this film very much pushes that Kevin is the real one. In the captions for Glass, when a different alter speaks, it goes Kevin as Patricia, which isn't how that works. It's just Patricia speaking. Kevin isn't pretending to be Patricia. It is Patricia. Patricia is no less real than Kevin is. They are all fragmented parts of one consciousness. They are all individual identities under the single conscious umbrella that is the entire system. And so it just does not make sense to say that James McAvoy played Kevin. He played Patricia, he played Dennis, he played Hedwig. He did play Kevin for a small amount. He played a little bit of Barry. He played a Jade. He played a bunch of different alters. And it doesn't, and I get that you can't necessarily accredit it to every single alter that he plays, but I swear there is a better way than saying Kevin, because Kevin is not really in that film at all. Just because it's the body's name does not mean that he is the real alter. And in Glass, it's more pushed on where it's like, I see why Kevin needed you. You were created to protect Kevin, blah, blah, blah. And yes, kind of, but also no. Like, it's not just that Kevin needed protecting, it's that the whole system needed protecting. It's that even that individual alter themselves, like Patricia, needed protecting from something. And like, some systems do function around like a core singular point that everyone's protecting, but a lot of systems don't. And the same way that we mentioned, there are overt systems, but the most are covert. We will continue to critique this idea that there is a core alter that everybody else functions around, because it's not the reality of most systems' lives. And until that is accurately represented portion-wise in media, we're going to continue to critique it every time we see it, so that maybe someone who's trying to create a fictional representation of DID will realize that that's not how it functions. That's just not how it functions most of the time. And it's frustrating to over and over and over again see these same reoccurring things that make you realize that these people somehow have a good grasp of DID because there's really accurate moments of representation and are still missing so much. The fourth thing that we liked about Split is how the amnesia is incorporated into the system. Again, this is a basic criteria of DID. It is a basic requirement for us to enjoy the DID rep in a piece of media. But we liked how there were multiple different kinds of amnesia displayed. There wasn't a lot of amnesia in this film, or in either film, but it also should be acknowledged that this system has seemed to be in therapy for a while, so it's quite likely that their amnesia has decreased a lot because they've been working on communication and integration. That wasn't explicitly stated within the film, but it's assumed if they've been in therapy for a long time. And even with that, amnesia is present in a few different ways. There are large memory gaps present. When Kevin is triggered to front at the end of Split, he thinks it's still 2015. I think the film was filmed in 2017, so that's 2 years. 2 years of missing memories. He doesn't know what happened in that time frame at all. Complete blackout amnesia time skip. Very common for ulcers who've been dormant, common for other ulcers far back in the headspace, common for ulcers with low communication to have complete blackout amnesia. And this is the kind of amnesia that's most often portrayed in DID media, these complete loss of awareness. And whilst it does happen, it's not the only type of amnesia that can occur. There's also grey out and emotional amnesia, and then like little things that are forgotten. And there's little things. That style of amnesia is also displayed in the film. There's a time when Dennis is masking as Barry and he's talking with Dr. Fletcher in session, and he's asking her questions that she's like, you know this already. We've discussed this, Barry. Like these are things that Barry should know and Dennis doesn't. And it's these small little gaps in memory that then reinforce that Dennis still does have amnesia. He has a fair amount of information, but he's still missing these little things. And that's very realistic to us. We'll know maybe a big picture summary, but we'll miss small little details that we'll then have to clarify. Like, you already know this, we discussed this, we talked about this. And it's like, I have no memory of that at all, but I do have the big picture information. And so it was cool to see multiple different types of amnesia, not necessarily explored deeply, but at least mentioned and touched on within the film. The fourth thing that we disliked about Split and Glass is just how unethical the treatment of the system, and in Glass, the other two prisoners, patients, people who are arrested, is. Focusing on Dr. Fletcher, who's the therapist in Split, who ends up dying at the end of Split. She isn't necessarily entirely unethical in all of her practices. There are moments in time where I'm like, it's not great practice, but it's not the worst thing in the world that she could be doing. However, towards the end of the film, she has a growing suspicion more and more that Dennis is in control, that the Horde is in control, I should say, and that Dennis has kidnapped 3 girls and is harboring them on his property. I need to again add caveats that I know calling the police during a mental health crisis is a last case resort. It can cause irreparable harm. It can result in the death of the individual who is experiencing crisis. It can result in the death of other people who just happen to be there because police violence is rampant, especially in America where Split is set. And I understand that calling the police is a last line of defense. However, currently, there is no other system set up in place to call when you think somebody has kidnapped teenage girls. And so it is the ethical code of conduct that psychologist would call the police because she suspects, she has reasonable reason to believe that there is significant harm to others possible. So she should have called the police on the system, and the police should have handled that situation. Instead, she rocks up at his property, she tries to deal with it herself, she gets killed. I don't want to sound like I'm victim blaming here, but I kind of am. It's her fault. The writing was stupid. She should never have ended up in that situation in the first place. And that is a major ethical violation, to just rock up at the place of residence of your client without warning, without reason, without request. Well, there was reason, but like without request, without the client allowing you into that space. That is bad practice, and it should not have happened. I also don't like how she approaches the seminar that she's meant to run, where she's pushing this idea that's like, the idea is real. These are all these really big differences that you can see in alters when, as I mentioned, big differences aren't a key feature in all DID systems. It's just differences. And her push on how big these differences are, to us, further misrepresents DID. We don't like Dr. Fletcher. We don't like her character. We don't like how she presents DID. She's not entirely unethical all around, but she does make very unethical decisions that result in her death, and potentially result in the death of 2 teenage girls because she didn't act sooner. And then there's Glass. It's Buzzkill. We were very, very triggered when we were watching Glass, and the majority of that is because of how unethically the hospital was run, where the system, and I can't remember his guy, but the other guy was sent with Mr. Glass was. The hospital rooms that they were set up in were set up as prison cells, which kind of makes sense. I get that they were a danger to others, but they were also set up, in our opinion, as borderline, if not actual torture rooms, where the safety switch to stop these people perpetrating harm was to either flood the room, in the case of the other guy who was in the system, to keep Mr. Glass incredibly drugged and wheelchair bound. Well, he might have been wheelchair bound because of his physical disabilities, with his brittle bones, but like they kept him incredibly drugged all the time so that he wasn't being able to use his brain. And then for the system, they installed lights that would flash, that would cause the system to switch. You cannot keep someone medically sedated or at risk of drowning or with a forced switch trigger there in an ethical way. That's unethical. Full stop. The end. No ifs, ands, or buts. I do not care that these were people who had killed people. I do not care that they were a danger to other people. There are other ways that you can install safety mechanisms that do not include torturing and medically sedating people. That is unethical. In fact, and it's also stupid because they were then relying on these things. They were relying on the medical sedation. They were relying on the flashing lights. They were relying on the water tank and the drowning to keep these prisoners in prison, which meant that they weren't then taking other safety steps when interacting with them. It resulted in the system almost escaping because one guy went into the room alone, and it's like, you don't do that. If you think someone's a risk to other people, you have somebody watching them, not just through cameras, in person. You take other safety measures instead of relying on these cruel and unethical and torturous methods to keep these people contained. And it was very, very difficult for us to watch Glass. We had to keep stopping and regulating because of how that hospital was run, because it was so unethical. And Glass in itself is just a shit film. I don't recommend it. But it was really, really triggering for us to watch. And it all came down to the fact that that's not how you treat people. That's not how you treat people. I do not care if these people have perpetrated harm. That's not how you treat people. We're down to our final thing that we liked about Split, and it has nothing to do with the DID representation in the film. The main reason that we like Split is because we think that Casey is a fantastic representation for complex post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. She has significant childhood trauma. She was sexually abused by her uncle. When her father died, she was then placed in her uncle's care. And her trauma is very relevant to the plot, but so are her trauma responses. She's very much an individual who dissociates, who disconnects, and who fawns. It was contrasted with the other two girls she was kidnapped with, who were ready to fight and to flee and to escape. Whereas Casey wasn't. She was like, we need to work out what's going on. She was much, much more subdued, which is way more realistic of someone who's gone through significant trauma. And it was, I liked the contrast between her and the other two girls. And I liked how she was depicted in Split. I'm not so much a fan of how her character was portrayed in Glass, with her befriending the person who abused her, but also kind of realistic that someone who's been victimized would then develop really complex feelings to someone who kidnapped them, but had also been victimized and was also experiencing trauma and had experienced trauma. That would cause a really complicated feelings towards that individual. But I don't like how it was portrayed that was a good thing within Glass. Potentially realistic, but I don't like how it was portrayed as not being a sad reality, if that makes sense. And I think my thing is that it would involve reworking all of the script, but I feel like they could have just made Casey the individual who had dissociative identity disorder and have the character that is Dennis just be a person without DID who was sacrificing her to not an altar but to someone else, to either a third party or a different entity or something. Like, the perpetrator didn't need to have DID within this film, and the victim very much could have, and it would have been way more realistic to DID and the fact that people with DID are way more likely to be re-victimized again than to be perpetrators. And I won't deny there are some people out there with DID who do perpetuate harm, intentionally or otherwise, because there are people who perpetuate harm intentionally or otherwise in general. And someone with DID is no more likely to do that than anybody else. It does happen, but it's not more likely. However, in media, it's consistently pushed as more likely. And that brings us on to our final point that we dislike, and that is the Beast. Split has had a direct impact on how people view dissociative identity disorder. It's often the only exposure a lot of people have had to DID, especially between 2017 to 2020. Post 2020, people had a lot of exposure to it on TikTok, and that's a whole other conversation where people now still don't think it's real and think it's a trend when it's not. But especially in that 3-year period between 2017 and 2020, Split was the only exposure people had to DID, us included to start with. And people think that it means having alters who are dangerous to people outside the system, having alters who will kidnap girls, who will sexually exploit girls, who will, more importantly, eat them and kill them, and who are violent and dangerous and scary and evil. And that, as I just said, is no more likely for a system to be dangerous than anybody else. Yes, persecutors exist. Yes, systems can sometimes have a lot of unprocessed trauma and trauma responses that can then result in levels of harm. But normally that doesn't present as active, intentional murder and kidnapping. And even when it does, that is the minority of systems in person and the majority of the ways that systems are presented online. We are not dangerous and violent individuals. We are individuals who have survived significant trauma. As I said just before, it would make way more sense for Casey to have DID and for her character to be the one with DID based on her behaviors and her reactions than for the system within the films to have DID. They did have childhood trauma. They do meet the criteria. I understand that. But in terms of dynamics and in terms of what their characters were doing in a real life situation, it's far more likely to be the victim than the perpetrator who has DID. And I am just so tired of having to justify to people that I'm not dangerous because their only exposure to my condition is through pieces of media that stigmatize us. And with all that said, it brings us back to the 3 questions that I asked at the start of this video. So let's go through our answers. Does the system actually fit the criteria for DID? Yes. They have 2 or more distinct identity states. There is amnesia present. It is not caused by anything else. It is not better explained by anything else. They meet the criteria for DID. Check. Does the film use the evil alter trope? Yes, it does, which really fucking sucks because there are parts of Split that we think are really accurate representations of trauma and dissociation, and they pretty much all center around Casey. And they had such an opportunity. They could have reworked the story to have some really, really good DID representation. And instead, they added to the pile of further stigmatizing a complex mental health condition. So did we enjoy the films? We did not enjoy Glass. We hated Glass. Glass was triggering. Glass was just a bad film, an objectively bad film. We would not watch it again. But we do enjoy Split, and not even just as a guilty pleasure watch. Split was the first time that we heard the words dissociative identity disorder. It was the first time that we saw some of our experiences represented on screen. Those little small things were like, that's relatable. It sent us down a rabbit hole of research and self-education, and then going to a psychologist and going, hey, I thought these experiences I was having was normal. I've since found out they're not. What the fuck is going on? Please tell me it's not DID. I don't want to have this. It seems like hell to live with. I had it. It sometimes is hell to live with. I still have it. It's not always hell to live with. But without Split, we probably would not have realized we were a system as early on as we did. It has a soft spot in my heart because of that. But it's not a good representation of DID. I enjoy the film. I'd watch it again. Oh, I also love shitting on it because there's so much wrong with it. Glass was just bad. But overall, these films are not good representation for dissociative identity disorder. They are significantly more stigmatizing than most other films with DID because a lot of people saw Split and a lot of people took it at face value and expect you to be really diverse in your system presentation, and it just, I don't know how to concisely wrap up the points I'm trying to make. It's just, Split did irreparable damage to society's opinions of DID, and even though I enjoy the film, I cannot deny that fact. So that's my thoughts and opinions on the representation of dissociative identity disorder in Split and Glass. We would love to hear your opinions if you're a system in the comments below. And Also feel free to add more requests for us to add to this series of analysing DID in the media. Specifically, we're looking for explicit canonical representation, and then once we've done that, we'll move on to like implied or headcanons and all that kind of stuff. We do have a list. If you suggest another piece of media, we'll add it to the list. And we hope you all enjoyed, and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.